Welcome back from the void, beautiful bastards. In last week's video, we found out who the Harbinger was. In this week's video, we're going to take our gray matter and we're going to build him. If you don't know what I'm talking about, click the link right up there in order to watch last week's video and find out what we're talking about. For all of you that have come back from last week's video, or even from the beginning, thank you, and welcome to Uncle Grimm's channel, where I read and create things. That being said, let's get into the chaos. So on this gray matter, we'll be using Vallejo's Hobby Paint aerosol can, aka spray paint, in their white in order to base coat it and prime it and get it ready for the next colors. So, for the carapace, as per all the other videos and that, I didn't explain which colors I was using. So right now I'm going to let you know that I use Vallejo Violetto Denso, Helix Lichen, Violeta Azul. I don't know if you guys can see that. Rojo Violeta, and then highlighting in the purple of the carapace I do with Pastel Violet by AK. And then for the bone structure, or the bone color I guess, I use Blanco Hueso, I use Blanco Sucio, and highlight British Roker, and Lodo Claro. Those are all the colors that we will be using for the carapace and the bone structure. I'll add probably some white as a highlight, and then I will also use a ink wash. One sec. Whole bean ink wash, like I did in the last video where we found out who exactly the Harbinger was. So yeah, other than that, let's get into reading and painting.
Chapter 9 Argentum Forest, Samnium Province Regium. They flew away from the sea, heading inland, swallowed by gloom of the forest. Voltus and Baraka sat side by side in a storm speeder as it hummed through the canopy surrounded by ocean-like crush of trees. Navigational data scrolled down Voltus's helm display, and he steered the storm speeder away from the tumult of branches. Other speeders followed close behind, carrying the rest of Squad Tanaro. "It is getting worse up ahead," said Baraka, gesturing to the cluster of trees they were approaching. The forests of Regium were savaged by a phenomenon known as the swell, a kind of tidal surge that sent smaller trees and plants cascading around larger ones in an endless collision that followed no apparent logic. It only happened once or twice a day, but there was no way to predict when. As Voltus looked at where Baraka was pointing, he saw a whirl of green and brown rush towards him, tearing tendrils and branches from surrounding trees. He gently nudged the flight controls and the storm speeder banked hard, coming so close to the swell that the branches whipped against the fuselage. "We have passed the crash site," crackled Sergeant Tanaro over the vox. "Did you see the remains of the launch?" "Yes, Sergeant," replied Voltus, "but the heat signals indicate the Xenos have moved on." He steered the storm speeder down an avenue of mountainous tree trunks, the canopies of which far out of sight, lost in the rain pregnant clouds, just as the roots were hidden in the darkness below. The trees on Regium were not only unusual in their size and mobility. Many of the larger, more stable trees were clad in metal, seams of ore that seeped through the bark, forming metal cankers and veining leaves like sap. Voltus had left the stability of the coast before, making several excursions inland, but he had never grown used to the idea of trees that ebbed and flowed. Some of the locals claimed they could predict a swell, but off-worlders had to rely on quick reflexes. The swell had almost passed now, but lashed out with a few parting strikes. Trunks collided, booming against each other like waves on a cliff. Voltus had anticipated the surges and steered the vehicle higher, flying over the tumult and back down into calmer regions. The clouds, after threatening for hours, finally emptied, turning the forest into a steel-gray blur and making it feel more like they were flying through an ocean. The sound of rain hitting the leaves merged with the crashing of the swell to create a seamless, thunderous din. It sounded like the forest was growling at them.
"This weather could be a problem,"
said Baraka, looking down through the rain at the distant forest floor.
"The swell could easily return. We should land."
Voltus nodded. "I think I will look for a clearing." He opened a Vox link. "I am preparing to land, Sergeant Tenaro." Visibility was terrible, but navigation runes on Voltus helms identified possible options. He waited a moment to be sure the swell had passed, and then he nudged the controls of the storm speeder, dived into the darkness with others following. Voltus had never landed this deep in the forest before, and as the shadows engulfed him, he felt like he was descending into an underworld. The idea triggered others, reminding him of mythical tales in which heroes made journeys into hellish netherworlds. There was something odd about the train of thought. His mind was not prone to wandering, and, unlike Baraka, he had no interest in legends. But the idea seemed strangely significant. He drove it away with logic, thinking back over his experiments with the symbiote, looking for connection he might have missed.
"Is that a clearing?"
asked Baraka. As he steered towards the area Baraka had indicated, Voltus saw something. "Movement at 11 o'clock. It is not following the same direction as the branches. Is that the swell?" "I see it," replied Tenaro over the Vox. "Too small and too fast to be the swell." Voltus stared at the shape. It was little more than a blur, like a raindrop magnifying the leaves behind. "None of the native animals have chromatic carapaces," said Voltus. "They are unable to employ this kind of camouflage."
"But if it was a tyrannid, I doubt we would have seen it,"
said Baraka. "Unless it wanted to be seen." Voltus looked around the shadowy trees. "Unless it wanted to prevent us noticing something else." He saw another blur rippling through the leaves. This one was closer and faster. "Like that?" "Apothecary biologists," said Tenaro. "Land and take cover." Before Voltus could reply, another shape rushed towards the storm speeder. He shoved the control yoke forwards, tipping the vehicle into a dive. The shape hurtled overhead, missing them by a few feet, and as Baraka snatched his bolt pistol from his belt and took aim. Voltus hauled the flyer out of the dive. "No, we want it alive." He brought the speeder around in a wide arc, narrowly avoiding the other storm speeders.
"There,"
said Baraka, pointing his gun.
"Another."
He leant forward against his restraints.
"You only need one alive."
This one was rushing at them head-on, about to collide with the speeder's nose. Voltus yanked the controls, flipping it a flyer onto its wing tip, so the shape hurtled past the undercarriage. For a moment he saw the creature, its camouflage slipping at the instant of attack, revealing 4 scythe-shaped talons and a segmented body parts. It was unmistakably tyrannid, but he also spotted something else. "This is not the correct specimen." Baraka twisted in his seat and opened fire, filling the cabin with noise and bolt shells. The shape tumbled in the air and became fully visible. Baraka's bolt rounds had torn its abdomen and dropped through the darkness. "You were not given the order to fire," bringing the flyer around.
No wings, muttered Baraka, ignoring him. But did you see its legs?
He peered into the darkness, studying the monolithic tree trunks.
It jumped at us.
Voltus looked around. They were surrounded by branches, tendrils. "Possibly. Let me set this thing down so I can examine the remains." There were no more attacks as the speeders looped towards the forest floor. Landing gear sank into the knee-deep mulch, and the ground belched as the ultramarines unfastened their restraints and climbed from their seats. They kept their pistols raised and trained on the surrounding shadows as they dropped down into the mud. They communicated in silence using hand gestures. Sergeant Tenaro ordered some of his men to fan out and guard the perimeter of the clearing while the others hid the storm speeders, cutting down branches with their combat knives. When they were done, Sergeant Tenaro crossed the clearing to join Voltus and Baraka. "Which way?" he signaled. Voltus nodded to a gap between the trees and opened onto that path. Tenaro hesitated. "Ambush?" Voltus thought, then indicated that they approached the spot from different directions. Tenaro signaled his agreement, and they left the clearing. Full darkness enveloped them. Even Voltus' enhanced vision struggled to reach more than a few paces ahead. He blinked runes across his helm, display triggering night scopes in the eye lenses, transforming the darkness into a blood-red swirl. He had his pistol raised in one hand and a combat knife gripped in the other. Now, even more than in his laboratorium, he felt at home. He was equipped with the finest armor and weaponry the Imperium could supply, but when the violence hit, it was his reflexes and his strength that would keep him alive. Often his mind was elsewhere, recalling facts, searching for correlation and casualty, but here, in the wild, he was utterly present, feeling every beat of his pulse, hearing every breath in the wind, feeling the forest teeming around him. The darkness was full of sounds, the scratching, scuttling, and fluttering of things that lived on the ground, competing with the whistling, prattling, and cawing of birds overhead. And there was a deeper sound, behind the bickering of the wildlife, a low rumble, gurgling sound like bubbles breaking mud. As he advanced, his suit's auto senses tracked Baraka and the others, showing them as blinking glyphs on the helm display. But it also revealed other life signs in the trees around him. Voltus had studied local fauna at length, categorizing the various species in a more scientific manner than the locals, who had labeled most denizens of the forest as spirits, weaving complex mythology around them but barely studying their biology. He paused under a low-hanging branch and studied the shapes blinking across his display. The nearest was serpentine and fast-moving, winding towards him through the mud. He stared into the darkness and saw the pale shape, a venomous snake. It posed no threat to an ultramarine, but to an unmodified human, the venom could be lethal. He disregarded it and studied the second shape. It was a pack of wild canids. They were circling the area, clearly after something. He thought for a moment, following their movements. Scavengers, he decided. And not foolish enough to attack. So why were they circling? Had they spotted the Tyranid Baraka had shot? Were they waiting to drag the carcass away? If so, they might regret it. Tyranid blood would burn through them in seconds. He tracked the glyphs denoting his battle brothers. Sergeant Tenaro, Baraka, and some of the others were heading towards the canids. But there was no sign of brothers Thraxius and Silvium. Their glyphs had vanished from the display. He blinked, adjusting the calibration, but there was still no sign of them. He could have opened the Vox channel, but he was reluctant to speak aloud. A clinging mist tumbled across the ground, hazing everything it covered, muffling the sounds of the forest. He had the feeling he was being watched. Unable to see Thracius or Silvium, Voltus headed after Baraka and the others, following a broad, muddy track up a slope and back down the narrow gully. The ground grew wetter, and the mist grew so thick that it almost was impenetrable. The sounds of the forest became strange and distant. When traces of light broke through from the distant canopy, they flickered across the tumbling mist, creating an illusion of figures and grasping arms. Voltus could see how the minds of less logical than his could have imagined this was a domain of spectral beings. He paused as he saw an area of deeper darkness near the stump of a fallen tree. He approached carefully. It was a carcass, the remains of a canid, larger than a man, possibly from the pack he had seen earlier on his helm display. He would have liked to have taken a sample of the acid that was hissing on its bones, but the whole mess dissolved as he watched, oozing quickly into the ground. There was something troubling about it. It almost was as if the ground itself was digesting the animal. He looked around and saw fragments of bone and hair where other creatures had rotted in the same way. A new sound rose from the mist, a slow, repetitive thud, like someone beating a distant drum. He clambered up and out of the gully, through a low place in the wall of bracken, and entered another clearing. There was a movement behind one of the tree trunks, and he dropped into a fighting stance, aiming his pistol as he advanced. The mist was so heavy that it took him a moment to recognize the shape that was an ultramarine, hanging upside down a few feet above the ground, swaying from side to side. He edged closer, still resisting the urge to use his vox as he circled the trunk. It was Brother Silvium. He had been hung from a low branch. The knocking sound was his armor tapping against the bark as he swayed back and forth. He was dead. A large section of his power armor had been destroyed, and his innards had been ripped out, left to dangle over his face. And there were shapes nestling in his corpse, pale, twitching, as they burrowed through his exposed organs. Voltus edged closer, gun raised, and saw that they were Tyranids, but even smaller than the symbiont, no bigger than his thumb, yet feeding with such a fury that Silvium's corpse was trembling. Voltus cursed silently. The death of a battle brother was always a tragedy. There were centuries of knowledge and skill in this single warrior, but for Silvium to have died so quickly and silently was shocking. Brother Apocryphy, Voltus, said Tanaro, speaking quietly over the vox. You need to see this. Voltus found Tanaro kneeling silently in a clearing, picking at Brother Thrasius' corpse. Baraka and the others were nearby, crouching in the undergrowth, guns raised as they watched the surrounding forest. The dead ultramarine's left side was intact, but the other half of him was melted, flowing into the mud just like the canid. His face barely recognizable as it bubbled inside his helmet. As Voltus walked over, Tanaro held up a piece of Thrasius' burnt flesh, part of his face. There was a thin trail of smoke drifting up from it where it had been splashed by acid. Voltus removed his helmet and sniffed. Then he nodded at Sergeant Tanaro, who nodded back and dropped the meat. The acid was Tyranid blood, and there was more of it scattered around the clearing. The Tyranid had killed Thrasius here and moved on. Voltus put his helmet back on and looked around the clearing. Again he thought how incredible it was that an ultramarine veteran had been killed in silence with such apparent ease. A gloom descended over the squad. They all felt the shame of the loss. Voltus saw faint heat traces on the side of the clearing where there was an opening leading into the trees. It looked like a creature had landed, bled, and then leapt a dozen feet or so, slipping back into the forest. The squad crossed the clearing, bolt pistols raised, headed into the trees. Mist swelled around them, as though trying to block their way. They followed the trail of broken branches, but then, to Voltus' frustration, the heat signs vanished, and there was no clue of the Tyranid's route. The signal from the cannons was still visible on his helm display. They were heading northeast, away from him. Perhaps they were tracking the Tyranid Baraka had injured, determined to be on hand if it finally died. He signaled to others, telling them to keep watch on the surrounding areas. Then he removed his helmet again, closed his eyes, and sniffed. Even as a youth, before he was remade by the chapter's apocryphes, Voltus had learned how to use all of his senses to hunt. His parents had taught him to harness every tool at his disposal in his battle for survival. But now, as he sniffed the forest air, he employed sensory powers that an unmodified human could never have dreamt of. He could smell prey. He could hear hearts of rodents hiding in the carpet of leaves. He could taste blood rushing through the veins of bats whirring overhead. He could sense a myriad of life forms digging and clawing through the soil. And then, after a few seconds, he could smell something that had no place in the forest. The acrid stench of Tyranid blood, oozing from a fresh wound and seething in the mist. This way, he signaled, locking his helmet onto his belt and leading the way down the narrow crevice. Lined with thorny undergrowth and dropping fawns, they carried on like this for nearly half an hour, fighting through the forest with all their strength and stealth they could manage. Voltus focused entirely on his prey, tasting crushed leaves and catching scents that hung in the darkness, while Tanaro, Barak, and the others followed close behind, watching their surroundings down the barrels of their guns. As they advanced, they saw more butchered animals torn apart and dissolving into the ground. Then, suddenly, as if the door had closed, the scent vanished, snuffed out like a candle. They were in another clearing, dwarfed by the trunks that circled it. They stood thinking for a moment, at a loss, until Baraka tapped the side of his helmet, indicating that Voltus should listen. Voltus could hear the unusual sounds of the forest, the noises of the animals fleeing from their approach, or else occupied with business of their own, and the patter of raindrops on leaves. Then he noticed something new and understood what Baraka was suggesting. He could hear running of water, not far from where they were standing, just over the brow of the next incline by the sounds of it. It sounded like forest stream. They climbed up the slope until they saw a stream spread out below. It looped and wound through the darkness, rushing down over a few small drops before joining a larger concourse further on. They followed the water until it met the larger river, but then Voltus was unsure how to proceed. The wounded Tyranid might have carried on in the river, heading downstream, but it might equally have doubled back and headed upstream in the larger river, or it might even have climbed up onto the opposite bank and headed back into the trees. They waded through the thick, weed-clogged water and clambered up onto the other side. There was still no obvious sign of any tracks or blood, so Voltus took some of the diagnostic equipment from a power pack on his back and began scanning the mud for things his eyes might have missed. This was not the work of a few stowaways. One or two Tyranids could not have slaughtered 2 ultramarines with such ease, not to mention piles of steaming animal carcasses that lay everywhere he looked. Baraka waved over to a stand of trees, pointing at something. "The locals are brave," he said quietly. He tapped on the tree stump. "Who would have thought they would venture this deep into the forest?" He was standing next to a kind of sculpture, a totem that had been carved from the stump. "Is that meant to be the Emperor?" Peering at the carving, it was a figure seated in gnarled wooden throne. He was wearing ornate armor that was stylized rendering of Adeptus Astartes power armor, and he was also holding a flaming sword. But he had a third eye in his forehead, larger than the other 2, and the rest of the sculpture was a spiral of root-like loops that whirled and tumbled out of the third eye. In some places, animal teeth had been pushed into the wood, huge incisors taken from predators incorporated into the design. "It looks more like a tree spirit. But look how well it's made," said Baraka, crouching to study the thing more closely and pressing his gauntleted hand to the surface as though communicating with the icon. "And consider the danger the artist would have been in while working. The forest teems with predators. Whoever did this would have been lucky to get this far without being poisoned or mauled or caught up in one of the swells. And then they spent hours making something this intricate. Tanaro shrugged. There is no accounting for religious zealots. Voltus was about to reply when Tanaro noticed something in the trees. He raised his pistol, causing the others to do the same. But then he grunted. Just another totem. Voltus squinted into the darkness and saw it. It was larger than the first, but similar in shape. Wayside shrines, said Baraka. I learned of them in the library of Karnas. The locals build them as waymakers leading to their gods. Old geo-engines. Voltus shook his head. Baraka's interest in the local custom seemed odd, even to him. It is irrelevant, he said. Tanaro nodded in agreement, quoting the Codex Astartes with as much gravitas as if he were on the stage. Know your purpose, then direct every thought and deed into it. But Baraka was not listening. He had already walked over to the totem and begun examining the carvings. We have to retrace our steps. We will just have to. His words trailed off as he noticed a familiar scent. Tyranid blood, he muttered, seeing the part of the totem that had recently been scorched by something brushing past it. Baraka laughed. It echoed oddly through the mist. See, tree gods have led us to our prey. Voltus was busy looking for scorch marks on the ground ahead, but he glanced back. You speak in jest sometimes. It sounds as if you really do believe in gods. I do not believe in gods, as you well know. But I believe we would be lost if not for the religion of the person who built these shrines. He took a tooth from the stump and waved it. I have faith in faith. Baraka had always played the part of the fatalist and mystic, but Voltus was starting to think it was more than just an affection. An ultramarine puts his faith in reason, warned Tanaro, and in self-mastery, not in providence and symbols. You would do well to remember that, brother Baraka. More blood, said Voltus, hurrying down the track. And look down there, said Baraka, pointing out a tall shape. Another waymaker. They had only taken a few more steps when a resounding boom echoed through the forest. They halted and looked at each other. Another swell, said Voltus. So soon after another one. Anything is possible on Regium. And if we remain down here, we will be torn apart. We need to get back to the speeders. Voltus shook his head, looking at the spots of streaming acid on the path. We could lose these tracks for good. Baraka thought for a moment. Geo-engines remain motionless when the swells hit. I read that in the library too. They are only stable points in the forest. That is partly why the locals used to pray to them. So we could shelter inside one of them? Asked Voltus. Tanaro shrugged. A reasonable idea. Did you ever look inside the one we destroyed at Sarax? It was vast. There was another booming sound, even louder than this time. That sounds close, said Baraka. I doubt we could make it back to the storm speeders now, even if we tried. And it would seem that our prey is also headed to the geo-engine. Voltus fixed his helm back on and used the display to scan for into the darkness. The geo-engine is close, a few minutes away at most. Advance, said Tanaro, and the squad ran on, still tracking the trees through their gun sights. They passed the next shrine with barely a glance, though Voltus noticed it was grander and than the previous two, clad in plates of rusty metal. A few minutes later they saw a huge silhouette looming up ahead. It was even larger than Voltus expected. In the darkness of the forest it looked like a hive city, like Salamas. an enormous rusting mast that soared up through the canopy and threw the forest into an even deeper gloom. How could the locals even have mistaken these structures for trees? He said as they came closer to it. It was similar to an amphora in shape, rounded and swollen looking. It was clad in roots, vines, and trees, but there were many places where its original surface was still visible. Patches of red rust punctuating the undergrowth, and the design was far too symmetrical to be a tree. Nothing seemed able to grow within a few 100 feet of it, and Voltus and Baraka found themselves running into the open across a dazzling expanse of sun-splashed mud. The forest was boiling behind them as they ran towards huge shape, but they were only halfway across the clearing when Voltus spotted something. He halted, raised his hand in warning, and pointed his pistol at the shapes in the mud. They were corpses scattered across the ground. He approached with caution, and as he reached them, he saw that they were humans, civilians wearing the white, rune-stitched robes of the native priesthood. Their swords were lying on the grass, and their bodies were a blistered mess. They had been torn apart and scorched by bioacid, their limbs and organs strewn across the blood-soaked mud. It must have been a frenzied attack. The body parts led all the way to the foot of the iron tree.
The Tyrannid attacked. They entered. The Tyrannid attacked and then entered, said Baraka, speaking over the Vox network rather than shouting over the din coming from behind them. And the geo-engine is as vast as a warship. There will be many places to hide. Keep moving, Vox Tenaro. In reply, he gestured to the oncoming swell. The trees were whirling up from the ground in a tornado of branches and roots, turning the forest into an ear-splitting maelstrom. Then ran past the final few corpses, and as they approached the structure, saw broad steps leading up between roots the size of hab blocks. The servos in their power armor responded as they sprinted hard up the steps, taking them 3 at a time, heading towards a pair of massive double doors at the top. The air filled with whirling leaves, and branches bounced off their armor as they ran. The ground was juddering as though in a grip of an earthquake. Then they reached the threshold and dashed inside, entering through a smaller door cut into the base of the larger ones. Baraka slammed the door shut behind them and slid bolts across while the rest of the squad scanned the room for danger. They were in a huge chamber that resembled a cavern hammered from rusty metal. There were tubular shapes lining the walls that must have once been pipes but were now so corroded they were almost indistinguishable from roots and branches that crossed them. If the room had a ceiling, it was too high to make out, and there were no windows of any kind. The illumination came from overhead, shafts of sunlight that had lanced down through the sweltering air and bounced off angles in the wall, hanging suspended like strands of gossamer. Voltus could see nothing moving as he paced back and forth, his gun trained in the shadows. The doors rattled and clanged, but held firm as the trees howled outside. He approached the nearest wall and saw people looking back at him from the metal, arms and legs spread as if they had been crucified. Sculptures? He asked, tapping one with the muzzle of his gun. Baraka checked the door one last time, then walked over to look. Burials, he said. This is how the locals used to dispose of the dead. They nailed them to the inside of these places, and the metal preserves the remains. The doors clattered again, and the forest roared outside. Are you sure these sites are unaffected by the swell? Said Voltus, looking around the juddering walls. Sergeant Tenaro nodded. They were built to terraform the planet. Lieutenant Castamon referred to them as calfaction pumps. They plunged right down into the core of the planet.
The original colonists used them to bring the heat to the surface. Voltus backed away from the fossilized bodies and surveyed the room. There are too many egress points. We must see if we can. Baraka silenced him by pointing to something dark on the ground. They approached it with caution and saw that it was blood. Not the seething acid left by Tyranids, but normal human blood. There was a lot of it, more than could reasonably come from one person. And it was smeared across the ground, leading to one of the doorways that led off the entrance chamber. They followed it across the room, and with the swell still screaming outside, headed deeper into the building. Chapter 10. Alesia District, Port Dura, Samnium Province Regium. The guardsman howled in his sleep, bucking against his restraints, then slumped and grew still, his chin on his chest. "Have you killed him?" demanded Beltis, striding across the interrogation cell. "Don't touch him," snapped Semler. Her Churigian, a chubby little man with a tonsure and a wet lip pout. "He's still wired up." He pulled on a lever on the device the guardsman was strapped to, and the motor died. Then he pulled a strip of parchment from a slot in the side of the machine, peered at it, and handed it to Beltis. "I don't think he's dead, but either way, he's not going to tell you much now. This is what I extracted. Looks like gibberish." "It's not gibberish, you idiot. It's just written in High Gothic." "You speak of High Gothic." "You speak High Gothic." "Of course not. But I've seen the phrase before, in my father's library." The thought of her father gave her a rush of grief. He was still where she'd left him, crawling in his own muck and feasting on grubs. She had not been able to bring herself to tell Semler or anyone else the truth. She tried to stay focused on the matter at hand, holding up the slip of parchment. "This is all he knew. It's all that made sense from his so-called vision. If you ask me, he was as deranged as all the others." He grimaced, waving vaguely to indicate the streets outside. Even up here, at the top of her father's hab stack, they could still hear sounds of rioting and gunfire. Port Dura had lost its grip on reality. The streets were full of lunacy and blood. "The Great Devourer." She looked closely at the text again. "That does mean something." She looked over at Semler. "Come with me." She headed to the door. "I'm going to need your help with something as sensitive." The library was locked and barred. It was a quirk of her father's nature that he kept the records and accounts, even of the most unlawful activities. For an average small-time crook, such punctiliousness would be dangerous, but it was a point of pride for Gathus Cole that he had no need to worry about the authorities uncovering his crimes. He was the true governor of the Regium, and everyone knew it. Beltis punched in his access codes, and they entered the large circular room, lined with cogitator banks, bookcases, and glass-fronted cabinets. The exterior of the Habstack was dilapidated as the rest of Port Dura, but inside it was as grand as anything in Governor's Palace at Salamis. There was desks at the center of the room, each with an ornate table lumen, and there were couches next to the books and logic engines covered in furs and throws. But despite its grandeur, the place had an abandoned air. There was dust on all the surfaces, and the lumens were all dark. On the opposite side of the room, a large curved window looked out onto the forest of Anchorage spars, warehouses, and refineries. Beltis glanced at the chronograph on her wrist, surprised to see how dark it was outside. "Where's the damned sky?" she muttered, marching over to the window. As she crossed the room with Selmer scuttling after her, she flicked some of her lumens on, punctuating the gloom with cones of amber light. When she reached the window, she saw that the sky was not just dark, it was moving. Port Dura was always bathed in smog, but this was different. The sky looked almost liquid, and things seemed to be snaking through it. She rubbed her eyes and frowned, realizing that she had not slept for days. I need to get some rest. She looked lower and saw that many of the hab blocks were burning, and there was no sign of anyone coming to do anything about it. Lower still, she could see flashes of gunfire in the transitway that passed the building. You said you needed me, said Semler, looking anxiously at the scenes outside. Soon, she snapped, striding over to a case full of data reels. She ran her fingers down a stack of cartridges labeled by hand with her father's messy scrawl. She taped one. This is it. She tapped one. This is it. She fished the cartridge out, headed over to the desk, and slotted in the cartridge into a cogitator. The machine rumbled into life, and she heard the tape spooling inside. Then the luminous green hollowness shimmered into view, hanging in the air in front of her face. The image was a blurry mess of static white noise. She muttered to herself as she turned the cogitator's dials. The image remained fuzzy, but the sound improved a little, enough that she could make out most of the words. The footage showed one of Mars' red-robed tech priests. His face was hidden inside an embroidered hood, but she could tell by the way his robes hung that he is more machine than human, with pistons and clamps in place of hands and a beard of plastic pipes hanging down from his hood. He spent the first 5 minutes describing his position in the hierarchy of the Martian priesthood, speaking in a droning monotone. Beltis shook her head, and wound the recording forward. The Magos was now describing in exhaustive detail the specifications of the recording device he was using. She wound the recording back and forward several times until she found what she was looking for. There are 5 spore-filled clouds, mass hallucinations, and outbreaks of citywide psychosis. This planet-wide hysteria and rioting seems catastrophic, but it is, in truth, only a prelude of the full horror that is to follow. Once a planet's biosphere has been fully poisoned, the predatory Xenos began their invasion in earnest. By that stage, there is little to no chance of survival for the local populace. Small groups of scout organisms give way to a far larger number of warriors. Organic artillery organisms that have evolved for the sole purpose of digesting biomass. The Great Devourer transforms the planet's flora and fauna into easily digestible slurry and begins to feed. This orgy of consumption does not cease until the planet has become a barren husk. Then, glutted on its feast, the Great Devourer continues on to the next world, and so on and so on. Beltis struggled to breathe as the Magus described scenes of absolute desolation. This is it? This is what's happening to Regium? She skimmed backwards and forwards again, desperately hoping that she was wrong. But the more she heard, the surer she was of Regium's fate. The Magos began listing the appropriate devices for displaying the message, describing every setting and interface in the mind-numbing detail. He seemed more concerned about how to get the best playback quality than the apocalypse that had just been described. Beltis was about to give up in despair when a static haze comment leapt out at her. The process of consumption is surprisingly fast. The Tyranid host is drawn to biomass as a moth drawn to flame. Escape craft are easily detected and consumed before they reach the upper atmosphere, although occasionally small single craft manage to break through the pall unseen as the host focuses its appetite on the larger prey. This is Barbarissus, she whispered. What? Whispered Semler. She looked back at him. His face was gray, and there were tears in his eyes. He looked like he was about to collapse. The sight of him looking so pathetic made Beltis realize she was being almost pitiful. She took a deep breath. The Barbarissus, my father's shuttle. She's like nothing else on the planet. If anything could escape this, she faltered, thinking again of the awful droning revelation she had just heard. If anything could make it off-world, it would be her. She is fast and light. Semler mouthed in silence, shaking his head, then managed to grasp what she was saying. A ship? You're saying we could escape this? He gestured at the frozen image of the Magos. Escape things he just said? She pictured her father cursing at cockroaches. Actually, yes. Perhaps I do need you. He grasped her arm, tears now flowing freely down his face. Beltis, I swear, I will never forget. She silenced him with a glare. But I'm not getting on a ship with a ravaging idiot. He nodded, looking even more panicked. Forgive me. He looked at the spectral Magus. But he said the great devourer surrounds the planet. If we flew up to one of the orbital platforms, we would be heading straight into the invasion. I don't mean we'd just fly up into the alien swarm and then stop there. We wouldn't just go into an orbital platform. The Barbarissus could reach the auger station at Crozea Point. From there, we could refuel and make it to the shipyards at Gabris. And if we make it that far, we could buy passage on a Chartist freighter. We could leave the solar system. We could leave the whole subsector. We have to tell the others. Beltis shook her lap pistol out and lashed out, slamming the handle into his face. He crumpled in a spray of blood, clutching at his temples. She calmly flipped the pistol around, and as he looked up at her, confused and afraid, pointed the muzzle at his face. Do you think we should tell other people what our plan is? He frowned, looking at the blood on his fingers and then at the shimmering Magos. No. Correct. Why will we not tell anyone what we are planning? He continued, frowning. Because only a single ship will have a chance of going unnoticed. Only a single ship, Semler. She holstered her pistol. Remember that. If Tyrol or any others of those worms know about this, she waved at the hololith, there will be a scramble for ships. Before we know it, there will be a whole flotilla trying to get to the Crozea Point, quickly followed by a feeding frenzy as those things up there see us all coming. She wandered over to the window, looking up at the shapes swirling overhead. Tell no one, Semler, or I'll hurt you in ways that make those aliens seem harmless.
If you like this video, and you like this style of content where I read things and I make things, then you can check out the playlist in my bio and watch the rest of the chapters in regards to this builds, I guess you could say. Other than that, glad you guys tuned in. See you guys, take care, and live for the Emperor.